History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Chapter 4 Political Change The Anglo Saxon World. By the end of the 19th century, the United Kingdom had created an identifiable subunit within the ambit of European civilization, with an historical destiny diverging from that of the European continent. The components of this Anglo Saxon world included growing British communities in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the first and last containing other important national elements too. And at the heart of it were two great Atlantic nations, one the greatest world power of the 19th century, one that of the next. So many people found it profitable to keep on pointing out how different they were that it is easy to overlook how much the young United Kingdom and the United States of America had in common for much of the 19th century. Though one was a monarchy and the other a republic, both countries escaped first the absolutist and then the revolutionary currents of continental Europe. Anglo Saxon politics, of course, changed quite as radically as those of any other countries in the 19th century, but they were not transformed by the same political forces as those of continental states, nor in the same way. Their similarity arose in part because of all their differences the two countries shared more than they usually admitted. One aspect of their curious relations was that Americans could still, without a sense of paradox, called England the mother country. The heritage of English culture and language was for a long time paramount in the United States. Immigration from other European countries only became overwhelmingly in the second half of the 19th century. Though by the middle of the century, many Americans, perhaps most, already had the blood of other European nations in their veins. The tone of society was long set by those of British stock. It was not until 1837 that there was a president who did not have an English, Scottish, or Irish surname. The next would be not until 1901, and there have been only four such down to the present day. Post colonial problems made, as they did in far later times, for emotional, sometimes violent, and always complex relations between the United States and the United Kingdom. But they were also much more than this. They were, for example, shot through with economic connections, far from dwindling as had been feared. After independence, commerce between the two countries had gone on from strength to strength. English capitalists found the United States an attractive place for investment even after repeated and unhappy experiences with the bonds of defaulting states. British money was heavily invested in American railroads, banking, and insurance. Meanwhile, the ruling elites of the two countries were at once fascinated and repelled by each other. Some Englishmen commented acidly on the vulgarity and rawness of American life, but others warmed as if by instinct to its energy, optimism, and opportunity. Americans found it hard to come to terms with monarchy and hereditary titles, but sought to penetrate the fascinating mysteries of English culture and society no less eagerly for that. More striking than the huge difference between them was what the United Kingdom and the United States had in common when considered from the standpoint of continental Europe. Above all, both were able to combine liberal and democratic politics with spectacular advances in wealth and power. They did this in very different circumstances. But at least one was common to both the fact of isolation. Great Britain had the channel between herself and Europe. The United States had the Atlantic Ocean. This physical remoteness long masked from Europeans the potential strength of the young republic and the huge opportunities facing it in the West, whose exploitation was to be the greatest achievement of American nationalism. At the Peace of 1783, the British had defended the Americans' frontier interests in such a way that there inevitably lay ahead a period of expansion for the United States. What was not clear was how far it might carry, nor what other powers it might involve. This was in part a matter of geographical ignorance. No one knew for certain what the western half of the continent might contain. For decades, the huge spaces just across the eastern mountain ranges would provide a big enough field of expansion. In 1800, the United States was still psychologically and actually very much a matter of the Atlantic seaboard and the Ohio Valley. If at first its political frontiers were ill defined, they imposed relations with France, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Nonetheless, if the settlement of the frontier disputes could be arranged, then a practical isolation might be attained for the only other interests which might involve Americans in the affairs of other countries were, on the one hand, trade and the protection of her nationals abroad, and on the other hand, foreign intervention in the affairs of the United States. The French Revolution appeared briefly to pose the chance of the latter and caused a quarrel, but for the most part, it was frontiers and trade which preoccupied American diplomacy under the young republic. Both also aroused powerful and often divisive or potentially divisive forces in domestic politics. The American aspiration to non involvement with the outside world was already clear in 1793, when the troubles of the French Revolutionary War led to a neutrality proclamation rendering American citizens liable to persecution in American courts if they took any part in the Anglo French War. The bias of American policy, already expressed in this, received its classical formulation in 1796. In the course of Washington's farewell address to his friends and fellow citizens, as his second term as president drew to a close, he chose to comment on the objectives and methods which a successful Republican foreign policy should embody, in language to be deeply influential both on later American statesmen and on the national psychology. In retrospect, what is now especially striking about Washington's thought is their predominantly negative and passive tone. The great rule of conduct for us, he began, in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Europe has a set of primary interests, he continued, which to us have none or a very remote relation. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Moreover, Washington also warned his countrymen against assumptions of permanent or special hostility or friendship with any other nation. In all this, there was no hint of America's future destiny as a world power. Washington did not even consider, other than European relations, America's future Pacific and Asian role was inconceivable in 1796. By and large, a pragmatic approach, case by case, to the foreign relations of the young republic was indeed the policy pursued by Washington's successors in the presidency. There was only one war with another great power, that between the United States and Great Britain in 1812. Besides contributing to the growth of nationalist feeling in the young republic, the struggle led both to the appearance of Uncle Sam, as the caricature embodiment of the nation and to the composition of the Star Spangled Banner, which became the national anthem. More importantly, it marked an important stage in the evolving relations of the two countries. Officially, British interference with trade during the struggle with the Napoleonic blockade had caused the American declaration of war, but more important had been the hopes of some Americans that the conquest of Canada would follow. It did not, and the failure of military expansion did much to determine that the future negotiation of the boundary problems with the British should be by peaceful negotiations. Though Anglophobia had been aroused again in the United States by the war, the fighting, which had its humiliations for both sides, cleared the air. In future boundary disputes, it was tactically understood that neither American nor British governments were willing to consider war except under extreme provocation. In this setting, the northern boundary of the United States was soon agreed as far west as the Stony Mountains, as the Rockies were then called. In 1845, it was carried further west to the sea, and by then the disputed main boundary too had been agreed. The greatest change in American territorial definition was brought about by the Louisiana Purchase. Roughly speaking, Louisiana was the area between the Mississippi and the Rockies. In 1803, it belonged, if somewhat theoretically, to the French, the Spanish having ceded it to them in 1800. This change had provoked American interests if Napoleonic France envisaged a revival of French American Empire. New Orleans, which controlled the mouth of the river down which so much American commerce already passed, was of vital importance. It was to buy freedom of navigation on the Mississippi that the United States entered a negotiation which ended with the purchase of an area larger than the then total area of the Republic. On the modern map, it includes Louisiana, Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, both the Dakotas, Minnesota west of the Mississippi, most of Kansas, Oklahoma, Montana, Wyoming, and a big piece of Colorado. The price was $11,250,000. This was the largest sale of land of all time, and its consequences were appropriately huge. It transformed American domestic history. The opening of the way to the Trans Mississippi West was to lead to a shift in demographic and political balance of revolutionary import for the politics of the young republic. This shift was already showing itself in the second decade of the century, when the population living west of the Alleghenies more than doubled. When the purchase was rounded off by the acquisition of the Floridas from Spain, the United States had by 1819 legal sovereignty over territory bounded by the Atlantic and Gulf coasts from Maine to the Sabine River, the Red and Arkansas rivers, the Continental Divide, and the line of the 49th parallel agreed with the British. The United States was already the most important states in the Americas, though there were still more European colonial possessions there. A major effort would be required to contest this fact, as the British had discovered in the war. Nonetheless, alarm about a possible European intervention in Latin America, together with the Russian activity in the Pacific Northwest, led to a clear American statement of the Republic's determination to rule the roost in the Western Hemisphere. This was the Monroe Doctrine, enunciated in 1823, which said that no future European colonization in the hemisphere could be considered, and that intervention by European powers in its affairs would be seen as unfriendly to the United States. As this suited British interests, the Monroe Doctrine was easily maintained. It had the tactic underwriting of the Royal Navy, and no European power could conceivably mount an American operation if British sea power was used against it. The Monroe Doctrine remains the bedrock of American hemisphere diplomacy to this day. One of its consequences was that other American nations would not be able to draw upon European support in defending their own independence against the United States. The main sufferer before 1860 was Mexico. American settlers within its borders rebelled and set up an independent Texan republic, which was subsequently annexed by the United States. In the war that followed, Mexico did very badly. The Peace of 1848 stripped her in consequence of what would one day become Utah, Nevada, California, and most of Arizona, an acquisition of territory which left only a small purchase of other Mexican land to be made round off the mainland territory of the modern United States by 1853. In the 70 years after Peace of Paris, the Republic thus expanded by conquest, purchase, and settlement to fill half a continent. Less than 4 million people in the 1790 had become nearly 24 million by 1850. Most of these still lived east of the Mississippi. It was true, and the only cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants were the three great Atlantic ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Nonetheless, the center of gravity of the nation was moving westward. For a long time, the political, commercial, and cultural elites of the eastern seaboard would continue to dominate American society. But from the moment that the Ohio Valley had been settled, a Western interest had been in existence. Washington's farewell address had already recognized its importance. The West was an increasingly decisive contributor to the politics of the next 70 years, until there came to a head the greatest crisis in the history of the United States, and one which settled her destiny as a world power. Expansion, both territorial and economic, shaped American history as profoundly as the democratic bias of her political institutions. Its influence on those institutions, too, was very great and sometimes glaring. Sometimes they were transformed. Slavery is the outstanding example. When Washington began his presidency, there were a little under 700,000 black slaves within the territories of the Union. This was a large number, but the farmers of the Constitution paid no special attention to them except in so far as questions of political balance between the different states were involved. In the end, it had been decided that a slave should count as three-fifths of a free man in deciding how many representatives each state should have. Within the next half century, three things revolutionized this state of affairs. The first was an enormous extension of slavery. It was driven by a rapid increase in the world's consumption of cotton, above all, in its consumption by the mills of England. This led to a doubling of the American crop in the 1820s, and then its doubling again in the 1830s. By 1860, cotton provided two-thirds of the value of the total exports of the United States. This huge increase was obtained largely by cropping new land, and new plantations meant more labor. By 1820, there were already 1.5 million slaves. By 1860, about 4 million. In the southern states, slavery had become the foundation of the economic system. Because of this, southern society became even more distinctive. It had always been aware of the ways it differed from the more mercantile and urban northern states. But now, its peculiar institution, as slavery was called, came to be regarded by the Southerners as the essential core of a particular civilization. By 1860, many of them thought of themselves as a nation, with a way of life they idealized and believed to be threatened by tyrannous interference from the outside. The expression and symbol of this interference was, in their view, the growing hostility of Congress to slavery. That slavery became a political issue was the second development, changing its role in American life. It was part of a general evolution in American politics, evident also in other ways. The early politics of the Republic had reflected what were to be later called sectional interests, and farewell address itself had drawn attention to them. Roughly speaking, they produced political parties reflecting, on one hand, mercantile and business interests, which tended to look for strong federal government and protectionist legislation, and on the other, agrarian and consumer interests, which tended to assert the rights of individual states and to advocate cheap money policies. At that stage, slavery was hardly a political question, although politicians sometimes spoke of it as an evil which must succumb, though no one quite knew how, with the passage of time. Such quiescence had gradually to change, partly as a result of the inherent tendency of American institutions, partly because of social change. Judicial interpretation gave a strong national and federal emphasis to the Constitution. At the same time, as congressional legislation was thus given new potential force, the lawmakers were becoming more representatives of American democracy. The presidency of Andrew Jackson had traditionally been seen as specially important in this. The growing democratization of politics reflected other changes. The United States was not to be troubled by an urban proletariat of those driven off the land, because in the West, the possibility long existed of realizing the dream of independence. The social ideal of the independent smallholder could remain central to the American tradition. The opening up of the western hinterland by the Louisiana Purchase was as important in revolutionizing the distribution of wealth and population, which shaped American politics as was the commercial and industrial growth of the North. Above all, the opening of the West transformed the question of slavery. There was great scope for dispute about the terms on which new territories should be joined to the Union, as the organization first of the Louisiana Purchase and then territory taken from Mexico had to be settled. The inflammatory question was bound to be raised. Was slavery to be permitted in the new territories? A fierce anti slavery movement had arisen in the North, which dragged the slavery issue to the forefront of American politics and kept it there until it overshadowed every other question. Its campaign for the ending of the slave trade and for the eventual emancipation of the slaves stemmed from much the same forces which had produced similar demands in other countries towards the end of 18th century. And the American movement was importantly different too. In the first place, it was confronted with a growth of slavery at a time when it was disappearing elsewhere in the Europeanized world, so that the universal trend seemed to be at least checked, if not reversed, in the United States. Secondly, it involved a tangle of constitutional questions because of argument about the extent to which private property could be interfered with in individual states where local laws upheld it, or even in territories that were not yet states. Moreover, the anti slavery politicians brought forward a question which lay at the heart of the Constitution, and indeed of the political life of every European country too. Who was to have the last word? The people were sovereign, that was clear enough. But was the people, the majority of its representatives in Congress, or the populations of individual states acting through their state legislatures and asserting the indefeasibility of their rights even against Congress? Thus, slavery came by mid century to be entangled with almost every question raised by American politics. These great issues were just contained so long as the balance of power between the southern and northern states remained roughly the same. Although the North had a slight preponderance of numbers, the crucial equality in the state and in the Senate, where each state had two senators regardless of its population or size, was maintained. Down to 1819, new states were admitted to the Union on an alternating system, one slave, one free. There were then 11 of each. Then came the first crisis over the admission of the state of Missouri. In the days before the Louisiana Purchase, French and Spanish law permitted slavery there, and its settlers expected this to continue. They were indignant, and so were representatives of the southern states when a northern congressman proposed restrictions upon slavery in the new state's constitution. There was great public stir and debate about sectional advantage. There was even talk of secession from the Union, so strongly did some Southerners feel. Yet the moral issue was muted. It was still possible to reach a political answer to a political question by Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state but balanced her by admitting Maine at the same time and prohibiting any further extension of slavery in the United States territory north of a line of latitude 36 degrees 30. This confirmed the doctrine that Congress had the right to keep slavery out of the new territories if it chose to exercise it. But there was no reason to believe that the question would again arise for a long time. Indeed, so it proved until a generation had passed, but already some had foreseen the future. Thomas Jefferson, a former president and the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence, wrote that he considered it at once as the knell of the Union. And another future president wrote in his diary that the Missouri question was a mere preamble, a title page to a great tragic volume. Yet the tragedy did not come to a head for another 40 years. In part, this was because Americans had much else to think about, territorial expansion above all, and in part because no question arose of incorporating territories suitable for cotton growing and therefore requiring slave labor until the 1840s. But there were soon forces at work to agitate public opinion, and they would be effective when the public was ready to listen. It was in 1831 that a newspaper was established in Boston to advocate the unconditional emancipation of Negro slaves. This was the beginning of the abolition abolitionist campaign of increasingly embittered propaganda, electoral pressure upon politicians in the North, assistance to runaway slaves, and opposition to their return to their owners after recapture, even when the law courts said they must be sent back. Against the background, abolitionists provided. A struggle raged in the 1840s over the terms on which territory won from Mexico should be admitted. It ended in 1850 in a new compromise, but one not to last long. From this time, politics were strained by increasing feelings of persecution and victimization among the Southern leaders, and a growing arrogance on their part in the defense of their state's way of life. National Party allegiances were already affected by the slavery issue. The Democrats took their stand on the finality of the 1850 settlement.